Leaders from 53 African countries, along with the chairperson of the African Union Commission, are gathering in Beijing as we speak in anticipation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which kicks off on Monday. In the past few decades, China and Africa have been working together, deepening trust, strengthening those ties, as well as building roads, bridges and ports. But with friendship comes scrutiny, and for some, China's involvement in Africa has echoes of old-fashioned colonialism. Well, next week, a chance for the Chinese president to set out his stall on the continent and hopefully set the record straight. How will China and African countries deepen their cooperation and promote bilateral ties to a higher level? And in what ways can China support African integration and interdependence of economies? And what does a stronger China-Africa Union mean for the world at large? Well, to discuss these issues and hopefully a lot more, today I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Yongpeng, Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Walter Regu, the Managing Director of Kamal Group, and Lindy Mtongana, the news anchor from CGTN Africa. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Jeff Moody. Okay, I want to start off with you, if I may, Zhang Yongpeng. It's very easy to see, isn't it, what Africa has to gain from this stronger union between the two countries. We're talking roads, infrastructure, we're talking $400 billion of investment by the year 2020. But what's in it for China?
And for the Belt and Road Initiative between African and China cooperation, it is one other track of the bilateral cooperation, because between the two sides there are still earlier it is FOCAC, and for Africa and China, and these two factors has been complementary with each other. And for Africa side, they have their advantages of development, for example the natural resources, and the laboring forces, and many young population, and the potential market. And for China, and we have also the industrialization experiences and technologies and the capitals support. And so in these aspects they can complementary with each other well, I think, under the initiative, I think. Right, the initiative could offer more capital support to the FOCAC, and because FOCAC for itself is comparatively limited in monetary reserves, and for the Belt and Road, I think in the future, because China is has been a global power and one of the major countries in the world, and so it needs its political interest or economic interest has been expanding to various areas of the world, including especially Africa. And so whether politically or economically for China, it is also very important. And so this is a win-win cooperation for Africa to obtain their development, for China also obtain its national interest.
Lindy, win-win cooperation, investment in Africa, it's very different, isn't it, to aid? I mean, I went to Addis Ababa fairly recently, and I was talking to a lot of Ethiopians, and I almost expected them to still be grateful for the British involvement in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, you know, helping them in the 80s, you know, raising money through records and all the rest of it. But that was not the case. There was a very strong message I got that sort of aid, the traditional sort, handing over lumps of cash and saying, you poor things, get on with it now, is actually deemed very patronizing, isn't it? This seems a much better way of dealing with it.
Absolutely. I think what stands out from China's approach is the sense of equals. China hasn't been quite as condescending as former colonizers have been, and patronizing, as you've said. And in that sense, Africa has been able to set this relationship on its own terms. Africa has been able to focus on its own growth agenda, as we've seen through the African Union's Agenda 2063, while also working with China, incorporating, say, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative into its own development agenda. So I think that specifically makes a very, very big difference indeed. And in fact, in just adding to what the professor said, Africa has also been able to influence policy in China. So as equals, China does listen to Africa, and the biggest example that comes to mind for me is the banning of ivory, the ivory trade in China. This is something that conservationists in Africa have been calling for years, knowing that if we're going to save Africa's rhino and elephants, we need to cut off the demand at the source. And China listened to this and adopted that. So this really shows the sense that, you know, Africa and China enter into this relationship as political equals.
Walter, you work very closely with businesses in Africa that wish to trade with China, don't you? There's an accusation that we're hearing of colonialism in a way. People, certainly people in the West, think, what's going on here? Why is China getting so many fingers in so many pies in Africa? What's that all about? Do you see signs of that, doing daily business between the continent and China? Do you see signs of China handing over money in order to gain influence on the continent?
It's a good question, but I think the issue of colonialism is actually overhyped. I think the issue of China being a neo-colonialist power is just a good story, and negative stories sell. The reality is China is in Africa for three main reasons, and these reasons have been there since the beginning of time, and they'll be the same going forward. Number one, the most important thing for China is the political connection with the continent. Africa represents over 50 votes in the United Nations and international organizations. The more China cooperates with Africa, the more Africa can support them on this side. The second is China's quest for markets. As China's domestic market becomes saturated and more Chinese look to go global, Africa represents a new market, and in most products it's an untapped market. So the businesses also want to gain that market. The third reason China is in Africa is that as the Chinese economy grows and as the Chinese economy shifts, there are certain products that Africa can provide to the economy that are needed. So I think using these three reasons, guiding not only China from a macro level, but also from a business level. I think also what people fail to understand is that Chinese companies operate like any other company. They're there for quest for profits. So there's not a broader scheme from the government. It's the private companies are in quest for profits like any other company.
Lindy, how evident is it when you're walking through the streets of Nairobi and other places on the continent, how evident is Chinese involvement?
It's incredibly evident, and it's probably one of the first things that people talk about when you ask about China-Africa relations. They'll say it's the road that China has built, it's the railway, it's the airport, it's the harbour that we value in this relationship between China and Africa. In countries, especially where I live and work, in Nairobi, the recent standard gauge railway project that was completed, the first section, of course, from Mombasa to Nairobi, it's made a huge difference for trade, but for tourism too. Just the ability to get on a train and get to the beach in a couple of hours, whereas before that took almost half a day. So you can really, really see that difference, and it's definitely what people often claim as the greatest positive that's come from this relationship, that infrastructure development all over the city.
Getting to the beach early is a very good thing. It's a very good thing indeed.
It is indeed.
Zhang Yupeng, it's also about ideas, isn't it? There's also a lot of talk about Chinese ideas, particularly on poverty alleviation, being able to share those ideas with countries in Africa.
Yes, up to now, for the poverty alleviation topic, in China has put, I think, a great deal of investment in that, and especially in the agricultural sector. And the China has offered a great deal of development assistance and lots of the projects, and especially, for example, the hydropower station. And this is one of the clean energy projects, dozens of that, and since early 1990s and up to the 21st century. And agricultural projects, for example, the agricultural technologies and the mushroom technologies, and some of the other bamboo weaving technologies also. And you could find, I think, find in lots of the African countries. And that is, the purpose is to lift the people, of the local people, out of poverty. And also agricultural demonstration, technology demonstration centers that has been established in Africa is also very, very good examples, because in these centers, and the Chinese technicians have been sent there within first 3 years, and contracts between the two sides, and the Chinese technicians are responsible to teach the local people how to cultivate the seeds of the plants. And after 3 years, and when the local people get these technologies, and they could be skillful enough, and then the Chinese technicians will retreat, right? Will go back to China and let them to manage them by themselves. And so by doing so, and they could grow and rice and tomatoes, potatoes, everything, and the corns. This is just what I saw in Rwanda. I stayed there 1 month years ago, maybe three or 5 years to 5 years ago, from Rwanda and Zambia to or another African country, maybe Kenya, as I remember, right? There are also such kind of technologies. It is by doing so, and China has been doing something to the poverty elimination of the African countries.
Lindy, what can Africa teach China?
I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier, of course, was the concept of around conservation, that this is an area in which Africa has been able to put its very serious agenda around conservation forward, and it's something that China has taken on. But I think beyond that, I think there is something within the relationship of China and Africa that is perhaps to some extent humbling for China, to see Africa as a continent that is rich in resources, but rich in its dynamic approach to problem solving, and to business and entrepreneurship, to innovation. Definitely that Africa is learning from China, but if you look at the innovation on a grassroots level that's happening in Africa, it's quite amazing to think of some of the things that have come from a place that no one would have expected. For instance, M-Pesa, a form of mobile money, is something that has really taken over Kenya specifically, but other parts of East Africa too, and it just shows that the uptake around technology and innovation is something that I think other developing countries can certainly take note of.
Okay, let's take a short break now, but when we come back I want to talk a little bit more about what a China-Africa union does to the rest of the world, how that plays out in the rest of the world, having this power base here, and what that can mean for the future. But we'll take a short break and we'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Lindy, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about Africa, because Africa, of course, is a continent.
Indeed.
There are vast differences between South Africa and Egypt, between Kenya and Rwanda, etc., etc. It changes. We've noticed recently changes of leadership. There have been some very big heavyweight changes of leadership. Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, and of course Emerson Mnangagwa, to name but two. How do changes of leadership change the way the continent views its relationship with China, do you think?
I think quite interestingly that, I mean, in those two examples, let's use Zimbabwe and South Africa, I don't think the change in leadership in those two countries has had any significant impact on the relationship between those countries and China. So there seems to be at the moment a consistent thread in those relationships between African countries and China. And I think that comes from this acknowledgement that Africa's own development, or the individual development of those countries, China's indispensable to it, in a sense. We can't talk about the future of South Africa or Rwanda or Kenya without talking about the involvement of China. And so I think in the interest of maintaining what is essentially a long-term relationship, this isn't just a passing little, flirtatious fling or something. This is a real relationship between these countries. And I think that's what maintains that. And I think it also comes comes from Xi Jinping in the sense that he makes these personalized visits to African countries. He's famously, I think, done about 4 Africa tours since he came into power in 2013, possibly more than many other world leaders, certainly, and more than any previous Chinese president. But those individual trips, I think, help to maintain a consistency in that relationship.
I shouldn't say this, but it's a sharp contrast to my Prime Minister, Theresa May, who is in Africa at the moment dancing.
Exactly.
There are endless shots of her dancing very badly. Walter, why now? Why do you think this conference now is going to be so significant? You were talking earlier on about the political shift that's taking place at the moment. Why do you think it's so important now?
I think if we look at what is happening in the globe, in the global economic situation, you know, the US-China trade war, the issues of immigration in Europe, there's a lot of tensions going on between the big powers. At the same time, this is the moment for Africa. This has been said before, but now we're really seeing it. And what China has done, the best thing that China has actually done for the continent is create competition amongst the great powers. The reason Theresa May is in Kenya is because they want to check the Chinese influence, right? And not only politically, but also economically. As you noticed, the reason the Europeans are coming to Africa now is no longer just a political issue, it's also an issue of markets. If you see the discussion between Theresa May and the Kenyan government, it was focused around economics, which is a big shift from the past. So I think this conference now is, it comes at the right time because these economic challenges are beginning to happen, and also it is the time for Africa.
Trung Yung Pen, you were talking earlier on about the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you see the Belt and Road Initiative panning out in Africa? Because of course the Belt and Road Initiative is to start with a geopolitical union. It's a very specific route, the Maritime Silk Road and the Silk Road, and it's there to increase the infrastructure and improve the infrastructure between China and East Africa. But how will it affect the rest of Africa as a whole, do you think?
And from the visit of President Xi's this year to the Western Africa, and China has signed the agreement with the Senegal. And also, and this is the first Western African country that signed such kind of similar agreements, because earlier African cooperation with China on the Belt and Road is largely limited on the eastern coast of the African continent, but now it's expanding to the west, and the whole African continent, and especially as one of the topic or major agenda of this FOCAC Summit, and one of it is the combination with One Belt, One Better Road initiative and the FOCAC itself. And so this is a big sign or a signal to indicate that China-Africa cooperation will not only limited within the FOCAC framework, but also on the global view. And so this is a good sign in this respect. And following the further one, I think this is a good time. Exactly, I agree with their view. This is a very, very good time because in facing the international situation, and especially the rise of the anti-globalization and the unilateralism and the trade friction, right, between China and the U.S. Now, what is important is we must make sure that, right, Africa, whether Africa or China or especially some of the other developing countries, all of them, all of us, have been beneficiary from the globalization, from the multilateralism, right? And so, if we let's say just let the unilateralism go and to do everything that will finally do harm to our development, right? Whether to the African side or the Chinese side. And so this is the right occasion, right? Or that is also why lots of the African leaders are right expressing their views that they firmly support the Belt Road and they firmly support the multilateralism right? Instead of the unilateralism. And so this is a good sign, and there's also a big significance for the FOCAC to be held at this time.
Well, it is a very strong response to Trump, isn't it, Walter? It's a very strong response to what's happening in America and other European countries at the moment. It's a real stand-up against protectionism.
Yes, definitely. I think, you know, if you look at China-Africa trade, of course there are challenges, and there will continue to be challenges. But the solution is not, you know, protectionism. The solution is to come up with better ways of dealing with the problem, whether it's elimination of certain barriers or whether it's more open markets. But again, I think you cannot necessarily compare the US-China trade with China-Africa trade, because, you know, the goods that are traded are different between the two regions. And you will see in recent years there has been more and more noise about China opening more its markets towards African goods. And I think this will be one of the key issues that's going to be discussed now, because we should not pretend that the China-Africa trade is completely perfect. You know, so these challenges, I think, will be more they'll be more visible in this conference than before.
What else needs to be done then? Because you, in your company, you work hard to introduce African businesses to Chinese businesses, to sort suppliers, to vet suppliers, that kind of thing. What more do you think needs to be done to ease that relationship between the continent and China in terms of business?
Yes, I think one of the key things is first, for instance, in America they have the AGOA program, which allows free entry of African textiles manufactured in Africa, which allows market access for those kind of products. And ironically, now China is manufacturing in Africa and exporting to the United States, which is actually a good thing for the continent. However, I think there needs to be more done by the Chinese side in terms of capacity building to export to the Chinese market. For instance, right now as China, the middle class and the middle class continues to grow, there's more and more demand for imports. And a lot of those imports can come from Africa. However, because of Chinese regulations, some of the African companies and some of the products do not meet the required standards, which is a non-tariff barrier. In order for those African goods to meet the Chinese standard, there needs to be more capacity building on the continent, especially in the field of agriculture. So this is one of the areas. The second is there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of noise coming from the continent in terms of the debt. There's this issue of China is giving too much loan to Africa and raising the debt. Whereas I believe that's not necessarily the case. I think China also needs to address some of these issues, primarily in countries like Zambia, Djibouti, and the like.
Chairman Peng, how significant do you think it is that there's one country in Africa that isn't involved in this forum, Swaziland? They're not accepting the One China policy, they're not involved with this. Does that matter, do you think, that there's one country that isn't playing ball?
Yeah, I don't think it matters much, but I think I'm quite optimistic in the short future and in a short time. The only one left in Africa will join in the FOCAC, the big family of China-Africa Cooperation. I'm quite optimistic, right? But up to now, everything is going on smoothly, right? Up to now, and because the last FOCAC in Johannesburg, and we have only 50 African countries.
48.
Yeah, 50. Yeah. 40,
so it's certainly growing.
48?
Yeah,
48 in 2015.
We're nearly there.
Yes, I remember it is 50. Right?
Well, 48,
yeah,
50.
But since 2016 up to now, 3 African countries established diplomatic ties with China, and I think the last one will soon join us.
Lindy, last word to you, if I may. We've talked a lot about trade today, but also this word that we bandy around quite a lot, people-to-people exchanges. And we've done a lot of stories here on CGTN about people-to-people exchanges, people from African nations coming over to China, Chinese Mandarin being taught in African schools. How important do you think it is that the African people understand China better, and perhaps more importantly, the Chinese people understand African people better?
You know what I've found, Jeff, reporting on China-Africa, on China-Africa relations, is that some of our reporting doesn't seem to have the desired effect, where negative perceptions around the relationship between China and Africa actually persist. Maybe because of the way that the narrative focuses on sort of the grand gestures and the macroeconomic level. But it really does help to show that people-to-people exchanges are actually taking place. It is the one area I find that is most impactful in trying to change people's perceptions around China and Africa. So when we look at some of the stories that we've done, for instance, on doctors, Chinese doctors working in African countries alongside medical professions from those African countries, the teamwork that is possible between these two, I think that actually helps a lot to change perceptions. So those people-to-people exchanges go a long way in helping Africans understand Chinese and the Chinese to understand Africa. They're very key to the relationship.
But more needs to be done.
Yeah, definitely.
And very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, Walter, security is a big thing as well. What do you think having a strong Africa-China union will mean for the security of the world?
That's a good point, and actually that's one of the issues that has really evolved in this FOCAC forum. Before, in the FOCAC, there was not really a discussion about peace and security. But in this FOCAC, it's going to be a key center role. And with China having established their first military base in Djibouti, not only to counter piracy in Somalia, but also to help stabilize the region. As you know, China was one of the key actors in negotiating the Djibouti-Eritrea border issue. So yes, peace and security, China understands now more than ever that a more stable Africa is conducive to the three issues that I mentioned earlier. So I think they cannot be separated. And as we saw recently, China hosted the major Department of Defenses from Africa in Zhuhai, so that it can not only showcase Chinese military prowess, but also discuss on how this relationship can take better. Because at the end of the day, if there's no security on a part of the continent, there cannot be any progress.
Walter, that's brilliant, because I know that was a slightly unfair question to say very briefly, if you will, tell me about world peace. So security, I think you did very well. Gentlemen and Lindy, thank you both, thank you all very much indeed. Young Peng and Walter Regu and Lindy Montana, thank you very much indeed for coming in to talk to me. And that's it from this edition of Dialogue from me and all of the team here at CGTN. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching.